The year is 1941. The humid air of the Malay Peninsula hangs heavy with a deceptive peace, a stillness that belies the tectonic shifts occurring beneath the surface of the British Empire. For decades, the crown jewel of Southeast Asia, Singapore, has been marketed as an impregnable bastion, the Gibraltar of the East. It was a symbol of Western permanence in an awakening Orient, a fortress so formidable that the mere thought of its capture was dismissed as tactical fantasy. The tragedy of Singapore was not born in the heat of battle, but in the cold, dusty corridors of Whitehall years earlier. The British defence policy, known as the Singapore Strategy, was a masterpiece of systemic self-delusion. It rested on a single, fragile pillar, the belief that should a crisis arise, a massive fleet would be dispatched from Europe to save the colony. But as the shadows of the Third Reich lengthened over the English Channel, that fleet became a ghost, a promise that the mother country simply could not keep. In the minds of the British High Command, the geography of Malaya was their greatest ally. They viewed the dense, emerald jungles to the north as a natural barrier, an impassable wall of vegetation and silt that no modern army could traverse. This racial and professional arrogance led to a catastrophic oversight. They prepared for a naval assault from the sea, pointing their massive 15-inch guns toward the horizon, while leaving the back door to the fortress wide open. They believed the Japanese were a second-rate military power, incapable of complex modern maneuvers. Across the water, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the man who would become known as the Tiger of Malaya, was proving them wrong. Yamashita did not see the jungle as a barrier, but as a highway. While the British stockpiled heavy equipment and relied on traditional road networks, Yamashita's 25th Army was stripping down for speed. They were a lean, aggressive force that had spent months studying the terrain of Indochina. They were not coming to fight a war of attrition, they were coming to execute a blitzkrieg on bicycles. The systemic failure extended to the very skies above the peninsula. The Royal Air Force in Malaya was a collection of obsolete relics and misplaced confidence. Pilots were sent up in Brewster Buffaloes, sluggish fighters that were affectionately called flying coffins by those who knew their limitations. They were pitted against the Mitsubishi A6M0, a machine so superior in speed and maneuverability that the resulting air battles were less like dogfights and more like ritualistic executions. The British air umbrella, essential for any colonial defence, evaporated within the first 48 hours of the conflict. On the night of December 8, 1941, the illusion of safety finally shattered. As the first Japanese boots hit the sand at Kota Baru, the British response was characterized by a paralyzing lethality of indecision. General Arthur Percival, a man of intellect but little charisma, found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He was a textbook officer facing a predator who had thrown the textbook away. Percival's refusal to build fixed defenses on the northern coast of Singapore Island, for fear of damaging civilian morale, remains one of the most baffling psychological failures in military history. The sea offered no salvation. In a desperate bid to project power, the British dispatched Force Z, centered around the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse. It was a grand gesture of 19th-century naval prestige sent to fight a 20th-century war. Without air cover, these leviathans were hunted down by Japanese land-based bombers. When the news reached London that both ships had been sent to the bottom of the South China Sea, Winston Churchill would later write that in all the war, he never received a more direct shock. The naval shield was gone. Singapore was now an island under sentence of death. As Yamashita's forces poured south, they utilized a tactic the British were wholly unprepared for, the flanking maneuver by water and wood. Whenever the British established a defensive line on the main roads, the Japanese simply took to their bicycles, rode through the plantations, or used small boats to leapfrog down the coast. The British, burdened by heavy supply trains and a rigid command structure, found themselves constantly outmaneuvered, hearing the terrifying sound of Japanese gunfire coming from behind their own lines. The retreat became a rhythmic, demoralizing crawl toward the tip of the peninsula. There is a persistent historical myth that the great guns of Singapore could not fire north. In reality, they could rotate 360 degrees, but they were supplied almost exclusively with armor-piercing shells designed to punch through the steel hulls of battleships. Against infantry emerging from the tree line, these shells were useless, burying themselves deep in the mud before exploding with muffled, ineffective thuds. It was a symbolic failure of the entire British mindset, they had prepared for the wrong war, against the wrong enemy, in the wrong direction. By the time the battered remnants of the British, Australian, and Indian forces crossed the causeway into Singapore, the atmosphere was one of stifled panic. The island's population had doubled with refugees, and the water supply, pumped in from the mainland, was now under the control of the Japanese. The fortress was not a sanctuary, it was a trap. The systemic collapse of the infrastructure, combined with the loss of the northern reservoirs, meant that the clock was ticking not just on the military defense, but on the survival of over 1 million civilians. Amidst this cascading disaster, flashes of desperate heroism flickered in the dark. At the Bokri crossroads, Australian anti-tank gunners stood their ground against Japanese armor, knocking out tank after tank in a display of raw courage that momentarily stalled the juggernaut. On the ridges of Panjang, the men of the 1st Malaya Brigade fought to the last bullet, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat to protect the approaches to the city. These were men fighting for a cause that was already lost, led by officers who had been betrayed by the strategic incompetence of their superiors far to the west. Yamashita, however, was playing a dangerous game of bluff. His own supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and his ammunition was running dangerously low. He knew that if the British realized how thin his forces truly were, they could turn the tide through sheer weight of numbers. He pushed his men harder, demanding a frantic pace to maintain the illusion of overwhelming strength. He needed Percival to break before his own army ran out of steam. It was a psychological duel between a man who had everything to lose and a man who had already decided he could not win. The final assault on the island began with a terrifying artillery barrage that severed communication lines and isolated frontline units. The Japanese crossed the Johor Strait in collapsible boats, landing in the swampy western reaches of the island. Confusion reigned in the British camp. Orders were misinterpreted, units retreated without cause, and the defensive perimeter shriveled. Percival sat in his underground bunker, the battle box, watching the pins move across the map as his options evaporated like the morning mist over the strait. As the Japanese reached the outskirts of the city, the horror of the situation became visceral. The Alexandra Hospital massacre, where Japanese soldiers bayoneted wounded men and medical staff, served as a grim harbinger of the occupation to come. The British High Command was faced with an agonizing choice: fight a suicidal battle through the streets of a densely populated city, or accept the humiliation of a total surrender. The water was gone, the food was dwindling, and the spirit of the garrison was fractured beyond repair. On February 15, 1942, the unthinkable happened. Under a white flag, Percival walked to the Ford factory to meet Yamashita. The images of that meeting remain some of the most haunting of the Second World War. The gaunt, weary British general sitting across from the stern, victorious Japanese commander. Yamashita demanded a simple yes or no to his terms of unconditional surrender. With a heavy heart and the weight of an entire empire's prestige collapsing on his shoulders, Percival signed the document. Over 80,000 British and Imperial troops were marched into a harrowing captivity from which many would never return. Continue.